Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Where in the world is Tim Mack? Well, I think he's in Kyiv. Tim
I am
Mack,
in
how are
Kyiv.
you?
I am in Kyiv, Jen.
Nice to see you.
It's great to see you.
So, we had an incursion into Polish airspace by Russian forces. What was that about? And how do you read the significance of its incursion into a NATO member country?
Well, it's important to realize that the Russian drone incursion into Poland, not the first time, even this year. That there have been about a half dozen to six or seven, let's say, different times in which the Russian military, either an air asset or a drone, has passed into Polish airspace. What's so significant about this one is that there were so many that the Poles felt that it was necessary to shoot some down in order to protect its sovereignty and its people. And that really is where we've seen the escalation most recently. That this is the first time a NATO country has fired on Russian air assets. In this case, even striking them and bringing them down. And that's led to a huge challenge for the alliance itself. We can talk a lot about the consequences being not just about Poland, but for all of the West and the NATO alliance, and the way in which Putin is trying to press some of these buttons and test the resilience of it.
Did you read this as an accidental effort, as a kind of testing? Let's see what NATO and, in particular, the U.S. says. Um, what do you read in terms of the intentionality behind this?
It's very hard for me to read the mind of someone like Vladimir Putin. Um, but it's hard for me to imagine that this is not a single drone passing over. This is a large number of drones probing the airspace. And when I look at this, and I take a step back and look at the strategic picture, what I see Putin wanting to do in general is to push some buttons and test whether the NATO alliance is really worth the commitments that are claimed on paper. Right? So what does that mean? That means that if I were Vladimir Putin, I'd want to cause some provocations. I'd want to, let's say the war in Ukraine had slowed down or ended, I'd want to kind of poke some troops into an Estonia or a Lithuania, a smaller country that's part of the NATO alliance, and see whether the alliance had the resolve to stand up to me, Vladimir Putin, uh, or whether it would wither and back down under the threat of a confrontation or a broader confrontation. Right now, I think we are seeing why Donald Trump's ambivalence about Europe, ambivalence about democracy and Western countries standing together, why that can be so dangerous. Because it leads to further probing, leads to further testing, it leads to further provocation. So what makes the most sense is that this was not an accident. This was a test not only of Poland, but of whether Poland's allies would unify around them, whether they would take stronger steps to confront Russia, or whether, like so many times in the past we've seen, the West will wither away from the challenge.
Donald Trump seemed to have failed the test because he was spouting the Putin line. Well, this could have been a mistake. What was the European response? Was that any better?
The European response is a little better. Um, the there was a very low bar to clear, right? Donald Trump, as you mentioned, tries to find any opportunity other than to blame the aggressors, in this case, Russia, um, and to avoid sanctioning them, punishing them, or even in many cases, you've seen Donald Trump rhetorically criticize Vladimir Putin from time to time, but his instinct is to do the opposite, which is to defend them, which is to explain away their bad action. Um, the exercise itself in shooting down these Russian drones that entered Polish airspace, it was a multinational affair. It involved a number of different NATO countries working together, tracking it and shooting it down. And so the European response has been better, although by no means united and and staunch in opposition to Russia. There's still a lot of reluctance in Europe, and it's actually something that Trump has picked up on. I don't know if you were tracking that Trump's new position on Russian sanctions, that he'll only do it if Europe stops buying, or sorry, NATO stops buying Russian energy. He knows this, right? And everyone knows that Turkey, which is a member of NATO, is a major purchaser of Russian oil and natural gas. In fact, the third largest in the world, and has some deep links to Russia. And he knows that he's made a demand that fundamentally, effectively cannot be
Right.
provided or cannot be conceded. And so as a result, he now has another excuse not to take
Yes.
action. The United
Yes.
States, of course, could take unilateral action, has in many cases taken unilateral financial sanctions actions against any sorts of its targets. The United States, as Donald Trump shows on a regular basis, plays with tariffs uh, like like he's on a juggling expedition. They're going up and down.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Russia, he is constitutionally unable to take a step that is substantively critical and adversarial to Vladimir Putin.
Now, no surprise, there has not been a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. What's been the course of the hostilities since the Putin-Trump meeting and since the Zelensky visit to the White House?
Well, the Wall Street Journal had a great story about this over the last few days, in which they tracked the number of drone attacks and compared them to various political events. And we saw the number of drone attacks in Ukraine decrease leading up to the Alaska summit, and then take a huge bounce back up in the period after. That is, that what appears to have happened is some sort of political instruction. Hey, let's not ruin the diplomacy, the diplomatic route, and then some signal after the Alaska summit. Okay, all clear to go. And we've seen a pretty broad escalation. In fact, there was an attack. I can't say quite where without telling you where in Kyiv I am, but about 500 meters from my house, from where I live.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and there's been a real escalation on targets in Ukraine. Um,
Wow.
Not to mention, I mean, we talked already for at length about the Polish incursion, which if is nothing if not an escalation by
Right.
Russia. Um, and so there is this feeling often in democratic countries that we don't want to take escalatory measures. But what do you do when your adversary is continuously taking escalatory measures? Is responding to an escalatory measure escalatory? I don't think it is. I think actually meeting strength with strength is actually in many ways de-escalatory in that it will
Yes.
reduce the chances of it happening again. I think sadly we're learning the lessons. We're going to have to learn the lessons of the 20th century yet again, and I worry about how
Yes.
many lives are going to be lost in the process of relearning those lessons.
Let me switch gears a bit to Nepal. We saw really some amazing events. Explain what the recent history of Nepal has been and what the basis for this uprising was and where Nepal is going now.
So Nepal is a pretty is a pretty poor country. Per capita GDP around 5,000 US dollars. Unemployment rate for youth over 20%. And it's in this context and the discontent around living standards and the society in Nepal that the stage was set for a real conflagration. Um, so what happened started off innocuously enough, which is that Gen Zers were on social media networks like TikTok, uh, talking about the strange wealth of the children of politicians in Nepal. And they started using um, hashtag like Nepo baby and Nepo kids, Nepo being short for nepotism. This did not go well. This did not go over well among the governing class, and the government really overextended itself by banning more than 20 different social media platforms in Nepal, including Instagram and YouTube and WhatsApp and all sorts of things. And this only further angered the general public, who then went out on the street to protest. The government once again overreacted. As the protests spread, and several of these protesters were killed, and hundreds were injured in clashes with police. And what that's led to is uh, widespread violence in Nepal, the burning of government buildings, but ultimately a resignation by the Prime Minister of Nepal and the establishment of a new government and possibly new elections. And so it is an example. I mean, I know that, well, I'm not Gen Z, I'm a millennial. But I know that when millennials were of that age, and I know that Gen Z, now that they're of that age, every generation views the younger generation as these no good nicks, too aloof, uh, you know, too focused on their own personal issues. Too obsessed with back in my days it was computers, being spending too much time on the computers. Now it's spending too much time on your phone. um, but what can we say about this situation except that Gen Z, when the opportunity arose to act, uh, definitely did not appear to be too aloof, but wanted to act in a democratic fashion and protest and demand their rights. And I think that's a real signal to, I guess, what can happen if you turn off young people's TikTok.
Exactly. And the regime that they were fighting against was very old. It had been around. There was a kind of hardening and aging, a lack of really any awareness of kind of modern society. It's also a story of when leaders get too old and get out of it, that they fail to pick up on signals from these younger generations. There is something to be said about older people stepping aside and letting a slightly younger generation operate.
I hope you're not talking about me, Jen.
No,
Uh,
no, you're young. I got socks that are older than you.
I think that's true, but I think that what our governments exist due to consent by the governed.
Yes,
Um, and that consent gets withdrawn, particularly when you lose touch with what the government are interested in. In this particular case, in Nepal, the reaction of the government, which was to dramatically overreach and then shut down methods of communication between people and methods of information gathering for people, and then to deploy policemen who then injured and killed protesters. Um, well, it doesn't take a genius to know that that's not going to end well for the government. Um, and so that's what happened in this case. But what it really does indicate, at least in my eyes, is that the skepticism and the cynicism about young people in the world, um, we shouldn't be too skeptical or too cynical.
yeah,
Our story on counteroffensive news about Nepal was actually a two-parter. We did a story about Gen Z protests in Nepal, but also Gen Z protests in Serbia that are happening right now at
yes.
the same time over in the Serbian case, it's about corruption, all stemming from the collapse of um, I believe a train station, which had
Railroad
not
Bridge. Yeah.
which had not been properly which had not followed the various safety protocols it ought to, suspicions of corruption, and those being the central points and the rallying cry around which Serbian young people especially, are now protesting. And I think, I mean, if the young people in the world are organizing, demanding their rights, I think we're going to be okay, ultimately long term.
I couldn't agree more. And it's also a lesson, folks, that these autocratic regimes are very brittle. The very thing that makes them autocrats, a closed society, a tendency to overreact, a inability to tolerate any criticism is what can break them. I think that's a lesson that Americans can apply at home as well. Tim, thank you so much. You really are everywhere, and it gives us a great insight into what's going on around the globe. Stay safe, and we will look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much, Jen. And if your listeners or viewers want to check out what we're doing in terms of human interest reporting and narrative journalism in Kyiv and around the world, they can check it out at counteroffensive.news.
Absolutely. It's a must read, folks. Thanks so much, Tim. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.